Okay, well, welcome. Might be afternoon, evening, maybe even early morning. My name is Saskia Kluit. I'm a senator for the Dutch Greens, and I will try to get you through this meeting in about 1 hour, 45 minutes. It's a meeting about rare metals and the way they impact our energy transition. And I welcome you also on behalf of the Global Greens, of course, and GroenLinks, the Dutch Greens, the Dutch Green Party. So let me start with some house rules. Mute your microphone if you can, unless I give you the floor. Use the Zoom hand or your own hand if you want to say something, if you wish to speak. If you raise your hand, make sure your camera is on. You can post questions in the chat. I put some of these questions to the floor and to the speakers. And it's, well, you already got the little sign, it's being recorded. So do not take the floor if you do not want to be recorded. And for those who feel more comfortable speaking Spanish, we have translators. So you can speak Spanish and there will be simultaneous translation for the rest of us. So that will be wonderful. Thanks to our volunteer interpreters, Maria and Candela. You will find the button for interpretation on the bottom side of your screen under the little globe, and it says interpretations. These are the house rules on the screen. So a short introduction of the workshop. Climate emergency leaves us no choice, but we need to leave fossil fuels and we need to enter the world of renewables. However, this transition requires huge amounts of metals. And by 2030, the world will need twice as much as lithium and cobalt as current mines can supply. So anyone who can count, and we Greens can count, knows there will be a problem. We need 25% more copper, according to the International Energy Agency, and nickel, manganese, platinum, and other rare earths will also be in great demand. And since the greatest burdens of metal mining probably fall in the global south, this raises the question of social and climate justice. And also the metal hunger of the energy transition may pose a rather big dilemma for the Green parties that want to overcome extractivism. I need to try and practice on that word. Well, after all, the Charter of the Global Greens identifies mining as environmentally destructive activity. So we cannot let it happen without any ado. So how can we achieve more sparing and more circular use of these metals, especially in the global north? Can we obtain the primary metals that we really need in responsible ways? And if so, how do we need to act? All these issues will be addressed by 4 speakers from 3 different continents. Wonderful speakers, I have to say. And there will be room for questions to the speakers. All of you can give your view either in the chat or verbally, if time permits. And we will first go to the speakers, have room for 1 or 2 factual questions, and then in the end, we'll start a debate. So I want to ask you to keep your debating questions until the panel. We start by a presentation of Richard Wouters. He's a staff member of the think tank of the Dutch Global Greens. He recently wrote this, he calls it a booklet, but I say it's a report on the demand of metals for the energy and digital transition. And in the chat at WOFA app, you will find translations of this report in different languages. And it is very informative, I have to say. It was part of an assignment by the Green European Foundation. You will give us some facts and figures, and you will give us the dilemmas surrounding the sourcing of the metals. You will also give us some suggestions for improvements. You'll have about 15 minutes, so go ahead.
Thank you, Saskia. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, you're very clear.
That's great. Yeah. So hello, green friends. My presentation is based on a report/booklet that I wrote for the Green European Foundation. This report focuses on the European Union, but I have had many discussions online with people from metal mining countries in the global south, and I've tried to take on board their views in my report. I look forward to discussing the issue of metals and climate justice with you. The world is facing a climate emergency. We need to switch rapidly from fossil fuels to renewable energies. Renewable energies not only require sun and wind, but also minerals, especially metals. Solar panels, wind turbines, power grids, batteries for energy storage and electric vehicles, electrolyzers that produce green hydrogen, they all require metals. In fact, a renewable energy system requires far more metals than a fossil one. So the more energy we harvest from the skies above our heads, the deeper we have to dig for the metals beneath our feet. This chart from the International Energy Agency illustrates the rapidly growing demand for so-called energy metals. If we want to live up to the Paris Agreement, the demand for lithium for batteries may be 40 times higher by 2040 than it is today. The demand for cobalt, nickel, rare earths in energy technologies is projected to rise dramatically too. Demand for copper and manganese, imported metals that are not in this chart, will go up as well. Take power grids, for example. They will have to be strengthened and expanded to be able to cope with an increasing load of renewable electricity. And that alone will drive up global copper demand by 25%, according to the International Energy Agency. In order to meet that demand, 4 new mines, the size of today's biggest copper mine, Escondida in Chile, would have to be opened. And we'd better not count on Chile to do so. Later, Gabriela Cabaña will tell us how metal mining has become controversial in Chile. The growth of renewable energy confronts us with different types of scarcity. Economic scarcity, when supply doesn't keep up with demand, price hikes and shortages will occur. For instance, the price of lithium has tripled in the past year. Physical scarcity, some metals are dug up at such a rate that the end of mining is in sight. Copper, for instance, might be depleted within a century. And then there is geopolitical scarcity. Some metals are mined in just a few countries. If those countries are badly governed or apply trade restrictions, security of supply is at risk. The Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, is the main supplier of cobalt. It is a country with many conflicts and many abuses in the mining sector, including child labor. Most rare earths are mined in China, and that country has already restricted the export of rare earths in the past for political reasons. So countries that are dependent on rare earths from China may one day be faced with the choice of having their supply cut off or succumbing to political pressure from Beijing. Like the USA and Japan, the European Union has a list of raw materials that are vital for European industry, but whose supply may be jeopardized. And that list gets longer with every update. Today, it contains 30 so-called critical raw materials, most of which are metals. And many of those metals are vital for the energy transition. One obvious way to become less dependent on imported metals is to make better use of the metals we already have. The good thing about metals is that they can be recycled over and over again. As such, and in sharp contrast to fossil fuels, they fit well in a climate neutral and circular economy. But we must become much better at recycling. Our most advanced devices like smartphones and solar panels are the most difficult to recycle. and many scarce metals end up as waste. So producers should be obliged by law to design for recycling. It must no longer be possible to put products on the market without knowing how to recover their materials. Also, all devices that contain metals should have a minimum percentage of recycled metals. The European Union is working on such law, for example, for electric vehicle batteries. However, in the short run, recycling cannot satisfy the world's hunger for metals. There is simply not enough lithium, cobalt, or rare earth circulating in our economy at present to meet the demands of the energy transition. So even as Greens, we have to face the difficult issue of mining. Can we obtain the virgin metals that we really need for the energy transition in a responsible way? All too often, mining companies cause ecological destruction, violate the rights of workers, local communities, fuel conflicts, violence against women. The next speaker, Fatima Valley, will tell us more about the impacts of metal mining in South Africa. I will take the Democratic Republic of the Congo as an example. It's the world's biggest supplier of cobalt, an essential ingredient for batteries. But mining is a curse rather than a blessing for the DRC. It provides a meager living for millions of artisanal miners, but it doesn't foster sustainable development or development at all. By fueling corruption and conflict, mining is rather an obstacle to development. Is it possible to obtain cobalt from the DRC in a responsible way? Some Western companies like Fairphone try to do so. They do not want to turn their backs on artisanal miners in the DRC, but try to help them work more safely and earn more. Responsible sourcing may be promoted by laws that oblige multinational companies to remedy abuses in their value chains. Frank Meeuwsen, our last speaker, will tell us more about that. When large amounts of the natural resources of a country are removed for export with little or no processing taking place at home, we speak of extractivism. Laws for responsible sourcing are not sufficient to bring an end to extractivism. Moving beyond extractivism requires that developing countries and their communities can freely choose to either stop exporting their natural resources or acquire the capacity to transform their raw materials into semi-finished and end products. Some NGOs in the Global South prefer the first option. Other NGOs and most governments and trade unions go for the second option. By building their own industry, they want to capture a greater part of the value chain. They might earn more and have better jobs with less mining. Even the Democratic Republic of the Congo might move up the value chain. The African Development Bank has developed an interesting plan to produce battery materials in the DRC. And this plan could benefit the European Union too, in view of its current dependence on China. China dominates the processing of energy metals, as you can see in this chart. And that should worry us. China's quest for economic dominance is intertwined with its political aspiration to become a leading global power, but China doesn't deserve that status. It has an autocratic, totalitarian regime that violates human rights, the rights of minorities, suppresses dissent, and threatens its neighbors. There are no Greens from China at this conference, as far as I know, and that is not a coincidence. So China is a systemic rival to the European Union and to other democracies. That's why, in my view, the EU should assist developing countries like the DRC in adding value to their metal ores. If the DRC were to refine its own cobalt into battery materials, it would not need to go through China before reaching Europe and other end users. That can loosen China's grip on supply chains. and it also cuts transport emissions. Of course, if Europeans need all these metals for the energy transition, they should look under their own feet as well. It would be unfair to shift the burden of metal mining entirely to developing countries. Europeans could start by looking at the mines they already have. In current mining operations, too many valuable metals end up as waste. Sweden is giving a good example. It is planning to recover rare earth for wind turbines and electric vehicles from the waste of its iron mines. Europe might even be able to produce lithium with low environmental impacts by extracting it from the hot water that is pumped up for geothermal energy. And what about new metal mining projects in Europe? I think they will only get off the ground if the EU sets high standards. And the slide shows the standards that I listed in my report. They include gaining and maintaining the support of local communities. And for indigenous communities, First Nations, the right to free, prior and informed consent should apply. And of course, European companies that import metals from the DRC, South Africa, Chile, etc., should be obliged to respect these standards as well. Because the EU is so reliant on imported metals, it has an obligation to push up global standards for responsible mining. People in the global south are already hardest hit by the climate crisis, for which they are not responsible. They should not also have to pay the price for its solution. That is a matter of climate justice. How much mining do we need? Perhaps less than the International Energy Agency predicts if we apply circular thinking.
Richard, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. The circular economy is not just about recycling. The most effective circular strategies are refuse, rethink, and reduce. This involves people in the global north questioning their current lifestyles. I will give just one example. Should we replace every fossil fuel car with an electric one, or is it better to share vehicles? We could make do with far fewer cars if we shifted to bikes, public transport, and shared e-cars. A rethink of mobility could save a huge amount of scarce metals. If one e-car were enough to replace 5 fossil fuel cars, the European Union would only need half as much lithium and cobalt as is currently projected by the European Commission. You will find more examples of refuse, rethink, and reduce also in the fields of digital technologies in my report. The last section is an agenda meant to inspire political action. Please note that all these actions would not completely remove the need for virgin metals. Even if the global north were to embrace degrowth and well-being economy, it would still need a lot of metals for the energy transition. We cannot dodge the issue of metal mining and the question of how to reconcile it with climate justice. We Greens can least afford to do so. After all, we are the frontrunners of the energy transition.
And how true is that?
Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to me. You can download my publication for free at metals4europe.eu, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Great. Does any of you have a factual question for Richard? I saw one in the chat already, which is a question about the relation and the cooperation with China. It's imperative to have any chance of meeting the IPC warming target of 1.5 degrees. So how do you look at the cooperation, non-cooperation with China? And
yes, exactly, because we need to cooperate with China on combating climate change. We should make sure that we do not allow China to play climate change and human rights against each other. And that's why we need to become less dependent on metals that are mined or processed in China. It would create a more balanced relationship that better allows the European Union but also the US and other countries to cooperate with China on climate change.
Okay, thank you. And this was a question of David Schwartzman, who came from the United States, if I remember correctly. Then there is a question from Til Rademacher. Aren't batteries that don't rely so heavily on metals in development? Solid state batteries, for example, and can then not be the outcome of this problem?
Yes, there's a lot of interesting developments. For stationary batteries, you can probably do without scarce metals and other minerals, using common salts like sodium chloride. For electric car batteries, it's a bit more complicated. Tesla and other companies are looking into lithium phosphate iron batteries, but phosphate, although not a metal, is a crucial mineral for agriculture and our food security. And we have to watch out that by promoting phosphate batteries, we do not drive up the price of mineral fertilizers and endanger food security. Of course, with a circular agriculture, you would need less mineral fertilizers, but there are some parts of the world, especially Africa, where the soil is very poor in phosphate, where they will probably need mineral fertilizers for a long time.
Okay, then I have one last question from Angelo Pagano. Will the ITER, I think this is for experts, ITER reactor change the outlook on metal demand? Or is this too little or too late? I hope you know what this is about.
The ITER reactor is for nuclear fusion, I think. And we will not have commercial nuclear fusion before 2050, I expect. So no, it is not relevant for the energy transition.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. You will join us later in the panel. And then we're going to go now to Fatima Fali, a voice from the South, an inspiring voice from the South, I can say. From South Africa, to be precise. It's an important metal mining country, some of you might know. For example, it's the world's top producer of manganese, a metal that goes into steel, into the batteries of electric vehicles. And you're also, as South Africa, you're not yourself, the biggest producer of platinum and iridium, two precious metals that will be in high demand of electrolyzers, which we all need for green hydrogen, another wonderful green transition. So what are the ecological and social impacts of mining in South Africa? We are happy to have you to answer all these questions and give us some view. For who don't know who you are the program director of the South African NGO Makua Vamua, if I say it correctly. I see you nodding, which stands for Mining Affected Communities United in Action. And WAMUA stands for the Women Affected by Mining United in Action. And that shows in the name already that the impacts of mining can be different for different genders. There's a gender dimension to mining issues which are overlooked. So Fatima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to share some of the learnings from South Africa. So just to give you some context into the movements that I'm part of, Makua and WAMUA were formed in 2012 as a response to the Marikana massacre. This was when 34 mine workers in the platinum mining sector were striking for a living wage and were shot down by the South African police services. This massacre highlighted the very real and urgent need to shape an alternative counterpower structure to contend with the toxic alliance between the mining industry and government in South Africa. Makua and WAMUA's primary aim is establishing a bottom-up democratic structure that centralizes communities and builds solidarity across struggles and across geographies. Ultimately, strengthening the capacity and determination of mining-affected communities, especially women, to effect the changes necessary to reorganize the sector. Women, particularly those living in mining-affected communities, are still forced to carry the cost of exploitative laws and policies in the era of a democratic South Africa. Women's voices are still excluded when policy and legislation is developed. The daily struggle for food, for land, for water, for health, for economic independence, for bodily sovereignty continues to be at the heart of Black women's struggles in marginalized communities. This layered, complicated, and entangled forms of violence is pervasive across all institutions in society, from home to community structures to the state. The consequence of which is women are locked further and more deeply into systems that engineer their oppression and violates their rights. A cycle that reproduces and entrenches gender inequality effectively. Now, the mining and extractive sector and industry in South Africa remains an important economic driver in our economy, yet it continues to be a site of massive oppression for women specifically. In 2018, Makua and Wamoa did a baseline report looking at coal, platinum. More recently, in a 2021 report, we looked at manganese. And when we zoomed in on the gendered impacts of the mining industry, what we found was that the findings were quite stark, not surprising, but stark. 40% of women indicated that in order to get jobs in the mining industry, this was only accessible through sexual favors. Now, this challenges the meta-narrative that is always punted by industry and the state that mining creates development, it creates jobs. That's not the reality on the ground. 73% of women indicated that they received no benefits from the mine. This is in terms of infrastructure, this is in terms of jobs, this is just in terms of social stability. All women indicated that the community experienced substantial amounts of violence, such as rape, murder, domestic violence, substance abuse. What was interesting was that 85% of women linked the increase of this gender-based violence to the development of mines in the area. And this largely has to do with, how employment schemes are designed within the mining sector, that it's still predominantly male, and changing the very fabric of a community when you have an influx of labor from elsewhere. And the state's endeavors to try and redress and substantially transform the sector has simply fallen flat. Given that the mining and extractive industry is predicated on patriarchal, exploitative, and historically entrenched unequal social and economic relations, it is little wonder that the MPRDA, which is the act that governs South Africa's acquisition, use, and disposal of mineral rights, place scant attention to women. And in fact, women's specific issues are omitted from special consideration in the main act. Simply put, there is no political will to break down the pervasive structure and practices of patriarchy that continues to condemn women to poverty, exclusion, violence, and abuse. Now, in the wake of climate change and the very urgent reality for an energy transition, it is important that we do not reproduce the same systems of oppression, whether this be in the manganese or the platinum mining. We cannot allow for another Marikana massacre. We cannot allow for the further and deep insult to Black rural women who live in the shadows of multinational mining and energy production operations, who still don't have access and the ability to afford electricity. So when we talk about an energy transition, it is critical to talk about a just transition. And I think this speaks a little bit to Richard's point around workings with China and human rights in that relationship. As long as women remain on the margins of consultation and decision-making processes, the gender bias and pro-elite bias in benefits and cost of extractive projects will not be adequately addressed and will continue to disproportionately oppress and abuse rural working class women. It's also key for us to look at the shortcomings of existing instruments. So if we look at the OECD guidelines, or in the case of the Netherlands, you had the Coal Covenant. These implements, while trying to improve the standards and transparencies, did not substantially address the key challenges within the supply chain and leaves ample space for companies to maneuver and relegate liability in ensuring that the rights of marginalized mining affected communities, and particularly women in those communities, are respected. Governments must take stronger actions to ensure that companies investing in natural resource extraction and have a particular role within the supply chain are not directly or indirectly complicit in gross human rights violations. Foreign trade policies must be reviewed and strengthened to ensure that, in the very least, human rights due diligence obligations, specifically a gender responsive due diligence obligations, are made mandatory requirements that is regularly monitored. Companies must engage in gender equality and human right impact assessments at all phases of their operational planning, from implementation, and there must be consistent monitoring. So just in conclusion, and in thinking of alternatives and what has been, I shared some of the demands from the ground, but just to share with you, in 2015 and 2016, Makua and Wamua, together with other civil society partners in the country, went through a very intensive campaign to envision what were the fundamental principles needed to redesign South Africa's mining sector. And after gathering a mandate from communities, which included local engagements with over 150 communities across across the country, specifically in mining affected areas, the People's Mining Charter was born and adopted on the 26th of June 2016. And basically, the People's Mining Charter is made up of 10 key principles, of which I know I don't have enough time to share with you all, but I'm going to share the one that I think if it is realized in our policy and in the way that the extractive industry manifests, has the potential to change the lives of Black rural women in South Africa. So this particular principle, and I'm reading directly verbatim from the People's Mining Charter, is as follows. Women must have the right to inherit land and should be consulted and provide free, prior, and informed consent on all issues affecting their bodies, families, land, and lives in both customary traditional structures, local, provincial, national, and international structures. Nothing about women without women. Sasha, I'll stop there because I probably am a little over time. So I'll stop there and wait for questions.
Well, thank you so much. This is a really, really great insight on how women are affected and how their position is still very, very dire, to be honest. If you tell me that 70% has no betterment from mining, then we are not even narrowing where we want to be. I'm looking if anybody has factual questions on you. Yes, David Schwartzman asks if you can share later on the link to the 10 other principles, because that would be really wonderful to have them. If you would say one thing, because there are not factual questions, then I might have one. What would be your first wish on the European floor political area? What should we do? Should we adopt People's Mining Charter?
I wish you would adopt the People's Mining Charter because it is quite radical and it will ultimately revision and reimagine what the extractive industry would look like, and it centers communities. So that would be the first answer. But failing that, I think in the immediate, there needs to be mandatory instruments, right? So for instance, we've got the UN binding treaty that's been on negotiations around holding businesses accountable against human rights. And the EU has not been very supportive of that, you know, in certain states of the EU. South Africa has sponsored that with Ecuador. And I think it's critical immediately for the EU and European states to start supporting that so that there's a binding mechanism. All these, you know, nice to have, businesses use that for good PR to say, we're part of better goals. So please look at our audit. We are doing so well, but they're not. And that information is not made as transparent as one would think. And there needs to be mechanisms and binding mechanisms to hold multinational corporations accountable. So in the immediate, that's what I'd like. In the long term, the People's Mining Charter to be adopted as a wish list.
That's a very clear message to us. I have another questions. We have still time. From Angelo, what is the position of the EU governments, especially the Netherlands, on the mining charter? Do you know that, Richard?
No, but it's true what Fatima said, that as regards the UN binding treaty on business and human rights, the position of EU governments and also the Dutch government has not been constructive. The European Parliament, on the other hand, directly elected by the European citizens, is in favor of this treaty. But perhaps Frank can tell us more about that later.
Later on, yeah, he's here, so he heard your request. Then we're gonna go to our next presentation, and that's by Gabriela Cabana. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, yeah. And also we are very happy that you come to share your knowledge with us today. You work at the London School of Economics, but you're also a participant in the Centro de Análisis Socioambiental in Chile. And you do research in your network to promote a new eco-social concept of development. So far, Chile has been the poster child for neoliberalism and extractivism, but it's world leading producer of copper. And you're also the second biggest producer of lithium, a metal which is essential for batteries. We had a photo article this week in our newspapers about your beautiful lithium mines. They look spectacular, but probably not so healthy. Maybe you can tell us about that. And times are changing in Chile. Metal mining has become controversial, and the ongoing constitutional convention and the election, of course, of a new promising left-wing president, Gabriel Boric, Chile seems to be moving away from simple extractivism and do something more strong with what's in your ground. And that might impact the global energy transition. It should also make us think twice about economic growth, even green growth. We all know that if it exists, it's a very small growth that we can do. Gabriela, please tell us more about how things are going in Chile.
Thank you, Saskia, for that introduction. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. It looks really beautiful.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's interesting that you started by making this comment on, you know, like every now and then we have this reporting about the mining and the beauty of the mining of lithium and copper. And I always wonder, like, if that, you know, it's the right way to talk about it, because this view from afar and above, I think, doesn't really reflect the huge damage that mining has in the different landscapes. My screen is frozen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Because if you can hear me, that's fine. Because I It's frozen for me, but it's okay. Yes, so as I was saying, well, then here you can see the Maricunga salt flat, which is one of the salt flats that still hasn't been exploited for lithium, and it's actually now defending itself against further expansion of the frontier of expansion of lithium. So in this brief minutes that I have to make some points, I want to share basically 3 points, 3 reflections that I think can help us situate these conversations more politically. I think this is a good space to talk about this. And I think this also complements very well with the points that Fatima just did. So first, to talk about sufficiency beyond efficiency. Many of our conversations about energy transitions today rely on this idea of efficiency, like very much, too much, I would say. Number 2, going into our more democratic processes, understanding that saying no to extractive processes is a possible democratic outcome and not just a failure of how we're doing our projects. I will go back to that. And number 3, I want to also make a brief point about how metals are never just metals. So it's interesting that you comment that mining is becoming controversial, because I would say mining has been controversial for a long time in Chile. We have a very sad and very wide history of tailings dam. I didn't know how that word was said in English. Relaves is the word in Spanish. We have a massive amount of these tailings dam that are, many of them, hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them, are just abandoned and are left to intoxicate the landscapes and the environments where people live, mostly in the north of Chile. And they have generated serious environmental disasters. This is just to show a quick view of how the city of Chañaral was before an avalanche with this toxic mining waste, before and after the avalanche. So you can see there how a complete area of the city got wasted and contaminated by these tailings. So this is something that has left deep scars in the landscape. And this is when we need to ask, what are we going to do this transition for? We need to first reach an agreement, a political agreement, on what level of extraction is sufficient for a good life for all, rather than just bet on increasing our production and extracting every single proven stock of these minerals, just because, you know, it would be a very good business for other people to do so. So how do we move closer to talk more about about sufficiency as part of the social and environmental struggles, as Fatima was saying as well, rather than just focusing on efficiency. Efficiency will never replace sufficiency. So the second point, this is also something I have heard in other spaces of conversation, that is that, you know, when local communities organize and fight back against extractivism, usually people working on environmental impacts, for instance, in policy of environmental impact, say, oh, that the project is rejected is a sign that the process was badly designed. And I want to say, no, actually, it might be a sign that the process worked. You know, like a possible outcome should also be that a community, a territory can reject the installation of new projects in their land. And we need to be able to deal with that, you know, like have the ability to say no. That is a very important form of freedom. And I here just want to highlight this woman that you see here in this tweet, Cristina Dorador. She's a member of the Constitutional Convention that is now drafting the new constitution of Chile. And she has been a very outspoken defendant of the desert, and to see the desert as a whole, as a living thing, as a living ecosystem, and not just as a place waiting to have the minerals that are below the ground extracted. So if you're interested in a scientist, she's a scientist, a microbiologist, really interesting. She's defending the right to the desert to exist in itself and not just to be sacrificed for the extraction of these valuable metals. So, you know, we need to deal with the fact, and this is both national and transnationally, with the fact that sometimes people will say no. Sometimes, for instance, indigenous communities will prefer to keep their lands alive rather than just opening for extractive projects. And actually, very interestingly, and maybe we can talk more about this later, the government that is now leaving wanted to leave lithium, like the tenders, the concessions, to like have that process finished now before leaving. And an indigenous community, an indigenous Koya community, actually managed to stop that. And now we're seeing if we're going to have enough time to contest that tender until the arrival of the next government that, as Saskia said, might be more willing to consider these issues more seriously. So the third point, and this is, I'm just going to go very quickly on this one, is that although we're focusing here on metals, and I understand why, because they can make very visible what are the limits, the material limits of the energy transition. We also need to consider all the wider impacts that metal extraction have in the environments where this happens. And here, this is just a map of one of the collectives that I work with that is called Chiloé Libre Saqueo Energético. Chiloé is an island in the south of Chile, and it means Chiloé free of energy sacking. And this is a map that we did to show what the impact of a new energy transmission line would be in the different rivers and waters of bodies of water in the island, to show and to contest this idea that, you know, this was going to be a harmless or like a project without any impact. And this is what communities are doing on the ground every day in Chile, and I'm sure in many other places, is basically to show that many things, many impacts that we see so contained, they actually have a wider impact, and they reach, you know, all the whole web of life. And this is like, you know, the constant reminder that we need to keep in our conversations. And just to touch briefly on this also, because Saskia mentioned it, one big red flag that I need to point out, because I'm speaking from Chile, in my positionality, is this whole myth of green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is now being part of a new fever, of a new El Dorado, you know, this idea of we are going to find this source of endless energy. And we are very much in cooperation and in dialogue with the European Union, in particular with Germany. So we are seeing this very aggressive policy that it's for creating this fuel that will be exported mainly to Europe. And this hasn't been debated democratically. This hasn't been assessed environmentally in its whole magnitude. And this is something that is concerning. And this is also something we're working on from my organization, Centro de Análisis Socioambiental. And that's the last thing I wanted to share with you. If you can read in Spanish, we created this platform where you can see the different impacts that the production of green hydrogen at an industrial level would have in our country. So I will just leave, these are the links, also so you can find more information, both of what's happening in the north with lithium and of the work of my organization, CASA. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I also have to open my microphone. Thank you so much. And you give us some really good, intense questions. One question I do have, factual question, is what do you expect the new constitution to say on mining? Because it's very inspirational, just, you know, to try to protect the desert as a desert, not for its use for people, but just in itself. But how do you feel it should be in the constitution?
There are a couple of ways or roads that can get us to this same place. So one thing that has a lot of support in the constitution is the idea of rights of nature.
Oh. This sounded like we lost Gabriela. We'll see, maybe she comes back real soon. Yeah, there you are.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what was that. Okay, I think it was only out for like 2 seconds. Yeah, so
welcome back.
Thanks. So I was saying about rights of nature. So I think that the idea of rights of nature can already give us a huge push to defend these ecosystems. And also very recently, so we are only now starting to draft the articles, like the actual lines of the constitution. One of them is for the renationalization of mining. And it was hugely controversial, you know, like many people came out saying, oh, this is bad, you know, it's bad for business. And for many people proponing this, this is the first step to renationalize the industry, to see how we can make it either truly sustainable or like see a way of like actually leaving mining behind. I am of the opinion that there is no such thing as sustainable mining. Some people think otherwise, but I do think that one shared goal of these different sites that are critical to how things are being done today in the convention has to do, like step 1 or step 0 is taking back control from the state of all these assets and all these concessions that we're were given for free and are now controlled by international companies.
Because do you feel that you have less control as a nation on the mining companies than when you? Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting because in Chile there is a whole ideology, and I think this might be common to other places, in which, you know, we say we are a mining country, and people will very proudly say, oh, you know, mining contributes 15% of the GDP, something like that. Is a very significant number. But when you see what is the contribution of mining, of copper mining, for instance, to the national income, I mean, to the budget that the government, like the revenues of the state, it's much less. It's like much below, you know, services and like other sort of economic production. So this is basically, look how good this business is, but all the benefit is not staying in the country. It's just going, you know, for this foreign power. So like we see very clearly, and they don't make themselves responsible for you know, all the waste that is generated, and it's still accumulating. You know, it doesn't go away; it's still there. So yeah, like this is a very clear tension and has been going on for decades.
I see. I'm going to look if there are any questions in the, not so much question. Well, I have one. You heard the story about Fatima. Do you recognize that also in Chile is going on? Marginalized communities, and even worse position for women?
Yes, I was actually fascinated because I haven't looked in detail on the gendered impacts, and I suspect, sadly, that it might be very similar. And you know what happens? I can give the example of Calama, for instance, which is like the most emblematic mining town that is you know, at the heart of the largest mine of copper extraction in Chile. And you know, it's very poor, you know, and it's very, you know, full with like all sort of malaise that you wouldn't want to see. And, you know, it's supposed to be the place that receives the more benefits. And the same with indigenous communities that are displaced or often are just like bought by the companies, just receive like very little economic compensation, but their complete livelihoods is just destroyed, you know, and their ecosystems are destroyed. And the ways in which they try to compensate the environmental damage are a joke. Like, I don't know, they dry a very old river, and then with I don't know the word, like a tube. Yeah, no, but I mean like with the thing that you use for your garden.
Oh yeah, a tube.
They put that, they put that in the middle of the desert, and they just put the water back, and they're like, oh, see, we're technically not taking water from the environment because of putting it back. And it's like, this is really not how ecosystems work, you know. you can you can add it on your spreadsheet that is going to count as compensation, but it's just not there. And communities have to over and over again make the point and document how this is just not respecting life as it is in the desert, you know, like such a fragile ecosystem. So yeah, definitely there are hundreds of examples of this sort of dynamic.
Great. Your point about the green hydrogen is also very good. I suggest we keep that until the panel, and we take it there. And we take now a 10-minute break, so we can stretch our legs, get something to drink, and do anything you want to do. And we meet again at 5 past the hour, which it's 6 at mine, but maybe it's 5 or 4 or 8 at your place. But we'll see you in 10 minutes.